Riot's not messing around this year, as 26.4 is set up to be another massive patch with 32 unique champions being adjusted. There's also a really big buff to the new ADC item Hexoptic C44, which will make it so much better on a wide range of ADCs. So we'll be breaking down all the changes and provide you guys with a complete update to the solo queue tier list for every single role. And remember, if you're learning new tech, broken builds, or macro and wave control strategies from videos like this one, you're already behind. By the time something hits your feed, it's either about to get patched or everyone already knows about it and knows how to play around it. That's why whenever our challenger players discover new tech, broken builds, or game-winning strategies, they post it immediately in our new meta updates course, weeks before you'll ever see it on YouTube, Reddit, or TikTok. For instance, AP Varus top lane was broken from the very first patch of the season, but the average player didn't discover that until a few weeks later, while SkillCapped subscribers were notified before everyone else. As a SkillCapped subscriber, you're also getting access to our newly updated Essentials courses, covering everything you need to master from Season 16, from fundamentals to advanced macro. Or even our Bronze to Diamond series, where we document hard-stuck players using only our content to climb through every rank. And if that wasn't enough already, every single week our challenger players upload 10 full game commentaries breaking down exactly how to carry games on your chosen champion in your elo, explaining every decision in real time. Best of all, you can get access to all this and more completely risk-free. As if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using our service, then you get every penny back. Check out the link in the description below for an exclusive one-time discount completely risk-free today. So let's kick off the video by looking at the buffs to Hexoptic C44, as it will now be an item you'll want to pay attention to in 26.4 if you're an ADC main. The passive range requirement to receive maximum passive damage is going down from 600 to 500. This is huge because the majority of ADCs have base auto ranges about 500, whereas most don't have ranges about 600 unless you count range enhancing abilities. So this will make Hexoptics way more consistent now, and we have a theory that the item could replace the Collector on a lot of ADCs. Stats are super similar on Hexoptics and the Collector, with the main difference being that the Collector offers 10 lethality, while Hexoptics offers bonus damage if enemies are at least 500 range away. Hexoptics is also cheaper than the Collector, coming in at 2,800 gold, as opposed to 3,000 gold of the Collector. Samira and Neela are the two ADCs that likely still prefer the Collector, because a lot of the time they are actually fighting enemies closer than 500 range, so they won't benefit as much from Hexoptic's passive. For ADCs like Caitlyn, Draven, Jhin, Aphelios, Twitch, and Tristana, pay attention to Hexoptics when the patch drops, and if you notice the item win rate outperforming the Collector, then definitely give it a go as a rush item for this patch. So moving on to all the top lane changes now. Camille is going to receive a quality of life buff to her E, to where if she does not hit an enemy with the spell, she will still gain bonus attack speed. So if you try to use E and the enemy dashes away, or you just whiff it, then you'll have a little more dueling threat moving forward. How much power exactly this buff brings is hard to say, but we can't see it propelling Camille significantly up the tier list, as we'll give her a minor bump going from B into A tier. Illaoi has been a very average top lane champ to start the season, so she's going to receive a passive buff, with the base damage being increased from 9 scaling to 180 to 9 scaling to 200. Keep in mind, the more tentacles you have down, the more impactful this buff becomes. So even though it's a 20 damage increase, it can actually be a 40 or 60 damage increase if you have multiple tentacles around you. And if you are in a bunched up fight and are hitting multiple enemies, then the buff becomes even more impactful. So we think this change should be enough to drag Illaoi out of the B tier, as we'll be moving her into A for 26.4. Not much of a surprise to see Gwen nerfed for this patch, as she was one of the few Dusk and Dawn users who continued to overperform in 26.3. Riot's going to be reducing Gwen's Q damage per snip, going from 10 scaling to 30 to 10 scaling to 24. Our base damage per needle is also being lowered from 35 scaling to 95 to 30 scaling to 70. So pretty substantial nerfs overall, and we expect for Gwen to drop down the tier list, as we'll be moving her from S into A. Another Dusk and Dawn user who continued to thrive in 26.3 is being nerfed for 26.4, as Kayle will be losing some damage on her Q, with the base dropping from 60 scaling to 220 to 60 scaling to 180. Q max did outperform E in recent patches, but with Q now becoming weaker at max rank, it will be interesting to see if E max is the better option moving forward. Regardless, Kayle will be moving down the tier list for 26.4, as we're dropping her from OP into S. Kennen has been one of the better top lane champs in meta, so Riot will be nerfing his R cooldown, going from 120 scaling to 80 seconds to 120 seconds at all ranks. For a champion who is so reliant on his R, a 40-second nerf at max rank is actually a massive hit to Kennen's late game. The champion just plays completely different when he has his R, as you basically don't even want to fight when it's down, so this nerf should reduce a lot of power for 26.4. As a result, we're going to be dropping Kennen down the tier list, going from S into B tier. Rumble is going to be nerfed in two different ways, as his base health is being lowered from 655 to 640. Our base damage per second is taking a hit hit as well, going from 140 scaling to 280 to 120 scaling to 280. So early game nerfs to Rumble, but that is where he's at his strongest, so we expect him to settle out as a pretty average B tier pick for 26.4. So if we have a look at how the top lane tier list is shaping out for 26.4, there's now just one champ in the OP tier, as Ornn will reign supreme. Now that Kayle, Gwen, and Kennen have been nerfed, if there is one champ who's next in line, it's definitely Ornn, as he's just going to be on another level for 26.4. Skill floor of Ornn is a little higher than most tanks, but if you put the time into him, he's so rewarding, as his laning phase is great, he scales absolutely incredibly, and can always make an impact in team fights with his long-range catch from R. Season 16 just pushed Ornn over the top, because the role quest providing more experience for top laners gets Ornn to his level 13 faster, where he then begins inflating the gold value of his and his teammates' items, and gives his team a gold swing just for existing. One top lane champ really flying under the radar for this season is Singed. Singed is insanely good with Protoplasm Harness, because when you combine it with Jockshow and the resist that Singed R provides, the healing coming out of Protoplasm's passive is incredible, and the movement speed and tenacity proc that you get when the passive activates is amazing for Singed as well. Super low skill floor for Singed, as well as it doesn't take many games at all to reach a baseline level of impact on him, and the champ is a top 3 win rate pick across all elo brackets right now, so he's a no-brainer pickup if you're looking for something new to play for 26.4. Riot's been loving their off-meta jungle buffs over the past few months, and we have 4 off-meta junglers who will be buffed for 26.4, starting with Brand. Buff doesn't look all that impactful, as passive monster damage is up from 265 to 270%, and passive non-epic monster damage cap is going from 40 to 50. We'll place Brand in the B tier for now, but we're not sure those buffs will be enough to make him a competitive jungler again. There was once a time last season where Darius was the most OP jungler, and he could look to make his way back into meta for 26.4, as Riot will be increasing his passive damage to monsters, going from 200 to 250%. Back when Darius jungle was OP, his passive monster damage was up at 300%, so it's not quite as strong as before, but we wouldn't be surprised if he's a viable pick again. We'll add Darius to the jungle B tier for now, but we definitely think there's a chance he could land in A, so we'll keep you guys posted after the patch rolls out during our updated tier list. Fizz jungle was buffed a little while ago, but he never gained any traction, so Riot's buffing it again for 26.4. This time, it's Fizz W damage to monsters being increased from 60 to 90. Fizz jungle was around a 45% win rate pick when he was played a little bit after his initial buff, so with this second buff coming through, we could see that jumping up to 47%, but we don't see him being a top tier pick by any means, so we're going to place him in the C tier for now. Maokai jungle isn't really a super off meta pick, as it's been played as a jungler in the past, but it's been quite weak for a while, so Riot will be buffing his Q damage to monsters, going from 120 scaling to 160 to 140 scaling to 180. So we're not expecting too much out of these buffs, but we do think Maokai should be at least an average pick moving forward, so he'll be placed in the jungle B tier. And then Teemo Jungle is a champ who had a few patches last season where he was a legitimate top tier pick, but then Riot nerfed it too hard and it fell out of meta. So they are giving it a small buff for this patch, with E monster damage going up from 145 to 160%. Of all the off meta junglers who are buffed for this patch, Teemo is actually the one who was performing the best in recent patches, so we can see him slotting in as an average B tier pick for 26.4. So those were all the off meta junglers who will be buffed for this patch, but there's also some more traditional jungle picks receiving buffs, with Graves being one of them. Graves' E armor per stack and magic resist per stack are both being increased for 26.4, so some additional durability for the champion. In theory, this should make bruiser builds more viable on Graves, but they haven't really been played at all in recent patches, so it's tough to get a gauge going into the patch as to how powerful they may be. So with these buffs coming through, we're going to give Graves a push up one tier, going from B into A. Udyr is going to receive a few buffs for this patch, with his Q damage going up from 5 scaling to 35 to 5 scaling to 45. So if you're playing Rmax Udyr, then this buff doesn't matter at all, since you aren't putting more than 1 point in Q. However, if you are playing Trinity Force Udyr and are going for a more bruiser build, then that's where this buff will come into play. A second buff that will impact Udyr regardless of what build you're playing is to his W, with the shield value going up from 45 scaling to 120 to 45 scaling to 145. Even in previous patches, Trinity Force Rush on Udyr was winning about 3% less than Liandry's, so we can't see this Q buff being enough to shift priority over to AD bruiser builds. W buff only comes into play later in the game as well, so we aren't expecting Udyr to gain very much power from these buffs, and we'll be leaving him in the A tier. Umbessa jungle will likely become obsolete for solo Q in 26.4, as her Q monster damage is being reduced from 150 to 125. Across every elo bracket in 26.3, Umbessa was a sub 48% win rate jungler, so with this nerf coming through, we don't see any reason to pick her up anymore as she's going to be moved from B into C tier. Riot's nerfing Rengar for this patch because he has been performing too well in the elite tiers of play, but that doesn't bode well for Rengar players across the majority of elos because it was only Diamond and above where he actually had a win rate above 50% in 26.3. Rengar is always going to be one of those champions who's impossible for us to rate accurately on the tier list because his power disparity between ranks is higher than most champs. Literally a 52% win rate champ in Master tier, but a 46% win rate champion in Gold, and we just don't see that kind of power gap with many other champions in the game. Since we do lean towards catering our tier list based on what's best for Diamond and below, we tend to have Rengar rated lower than you may see high elo players rate him on their tier list. Q is being changed for this patch with a bunch of numbers being shifted around, but if we just take a look at the comparison clips, we can see it's about a 10 damage nerf when you have your Umbral Glaive completed. So not a major blow, but still a nerf nonetheless, and we'll be keeping Rengar placed in the jungle B tier for now. One champ we are a little bit surprised is on the nerf list for 26.4 is Zac. So Zac has been a pretty solid jungler in recent patches, but his play rate isn't elevated at all, and his win rate sits at a respectable 51% level, so usually that isn't where Riot draws the line for a nerfable champ. Nonetheless, Zac is being nerfed in two different ways with his Q damage going down. Riot has stated that Q will be nerfed from ranks 1 to 4 in the spell, but in other words, this is a nerf up until you hit level 18 because you don't max your Q out until last. R damage is being reduced as well, going from 350 scaling to 700 to 300 scaling to 650. So actually somewhat impactful nerfs for a champ that we didn't really think was in need of nerfs in the first place, so we'll be dropping Zac down the tier list going from S into A tier. So if we have a look at the jungle tier list, it's pretty similar to last patch with Briar taking home the OP tier slot as she's been outperforming since her buff from 26.3. One new addition to the tier list for this patch is Nasus, as he's been on the rise lately with this really interesting new build. Protoplasm Harness into Iceborne Gauntlet and Jaksho is working incredibly well for Nasus jungle right now. We made a YouTube short a few weeks ago talking about how insane the Protoplasm with Jaksho synergy is, so it's cool to see it come to fruition on an off-meta pick like Nasus jungle. We covered the Gwen nerfs when going over top lane, but they will negatively impact Gwen in the jungle as well, so she's going to be bumped down a tier going from S into A. As we see more Zehen being played in the jungle, it's pretty clear that the buffs last patch have turned him into a really strong pick. Zehen actually has a better win rate as a jungler than he does as a top laner right now, while his pick rate is creeping up to the level of top lane as well, so if you are someone who likes to queue both top and jungle, then Zehen is a great champ to spam for 26.4. It's been a while since Annie was a meta mid lane pick for solo queue, so Riot's buffing her Q base damage, going from 80 scaling to 240 to 80 scaling to 260. A pretty big E buff is being issued as well, with the cooldown dropping from 12 scaling to 10 seconds to 10 seconds at all ranks. So 2 seconds off E in the early game, which is going to make Annie's laning much better in certain matchups. For example, let's say Annie was laning into Echo last patch. Echo's Q and E both have 9-second cooldowns early on, so if Echo were to dive on Annie and blow her E, he would then have a 3-second window where his spells would come back up and Annie would be without her E. Now that window is only 1 second for Echo, so it's almost impossible for him to capitalize on that for 26.4. So we think these buffs will actually help Annie out a significant amount, and we'll be moving her from A into S tier. Hui is next in line for a couple of buffs, with his R cooldown being reduced by 20 seconds at the first rank in the spell, so more windows of opportunity for Hui throughout the early game moving forward. W base shield is going up from 100 scaling to 200 to 100 scaling to 260, while WW effectiveness on allies is going from 75 to 85%. This W buff isn't actually all that impactful because it is the spell that you max out last on Hui, so the fact that the shield value is still the same at rank 1 means you won't start benefiting from the change until at least level 14, so it's definitely the R buff that is most impactful, and we can see Hui being a really solid pick for 26.4. Whether he gains enough power to slide into S tier is a tough call, so we're going to leave him in A for now and could look to bump him up for the updated tier list. Kassadin has been one of the best mid laners in Season 16, so he will be nerfed in 2 different ways, with his E slow being lowered from 50 scaling to 90% to 50 scaling to 70%. Health growth is being reduced as well, going from 119 to 113. Definitely not the end of the world for Kassadin, but we don't see him being OP tier worthy anymore, so we'll be dropping him into S. Naafiri is another mid lane champ we had rated in the OP tier last patch, and Riot has the same thoughts on her strength, as they will be nerfing her in 26.4, with health regen going from 7.5 to 6. Q mana cost is being adjusted from 55 scaling to 75 to 50 scaling to 90, and then E mana cost is up from 35 to 40. So a bit of a hit to the laning of Naafiri, but in the grand scheme of things, we can't see the nerfs reducing her power by a super substantial amount, so we'll only be dropping her from OP into S. Qiyana is next in line for a nerf, with her health growth being reduced from 121 to 115. Qiyana was just barely holding on to an S tier spot in recent patches, so even though this nerf isn't anything massive, we're going to move her down to A for 26.4. Syndra has been one of the best performing mages in recent patches, so she's going to be nerfed with her W damage dropping from 70 scaling to 210 to 70 scaling to 190. Our base damage per sphere is going down from 90 scaling to 170 to 80 scaling to 160. So very important to realize that 10 damage per sphere nerf actually means a minimum 30 damage nerf per R, since Syndra is guaranteed to hit a minimum of 3 spheres. If she has 2 Q charges on the ground though, which she should if she's going for an all-in, then it's actually a 50 damage nerf to Syndra's R. We could be overestimating the changes, but on paper they look to be quite impactful, so we're going to be dropping Syndra from S into B tier for 26.4. B could be too much of a reach, but we definitely don't expect for Syndra to be an S tier pick after these nerfs. So Ryze is going to be issued a quality of life change for this patch so that R is more predictable. In the past, his R would predict where you would want to walk and sometimes not pull you through the realm more, but it's now going to be plain and simple to where if you are inside of the circle, then you will be grabbed and teleported. We don't expect for this change to influence Ryze's power level for solo queue, so he's going to continue to be placed in the C tier after becoming a pretty weak solo queue champ due to the 26.3 changes. It's not very often that we have just one champion placed in the OP tier for multiple roles, but that's the case for top, jungle, and mid right now, as Ahri is going to be the lone OP pick for mid lane. With Nefarian casted and nerfed for this patch, and with Ahri overperforming a ton for her buff from 26.3, she will be the standalone best mid lane champ throughout 26.4. Every single metric is heavily inflated for Ahri right now, as she not only holds the highest play rate for any mid lane champ in the game, but she has a top 10 win rate as well, so all bias aside, she's in an incredible spot right now. Swain is getting nerfed for this patch, but bot lane is his most popular role right now, so we'll cover the changes in detail when going over bot lane, but the nerfs will impact Swain as a mid laner too. Two of the nerfs are AP ratio changes though, and because Swain doesn't stack a whole lot of AP in his build due to the fact he never buys Rabadons, we honestly don't see the nerfs being all that impactful, so we'll leave Swain in the S tier for now. Lux is also being adjusted this patch, but the changes are more so aimed at helping support Lux than mid lane Lux, so we're gonna leave Lux placed in the A tier, but there's a chance we move her into S for the mid patch tier list if the buffs do land a bit more impactful than expected. Heading down to the bot lane now, Riot's going to be buffing Samira for this patch with the lifesteal effectiveness on her Q and R being increased from 80 to 100%. This will help out Samira regardless of what build you run because she takes Bloodline and runes, but Bloodthirster value does shoot up a bit for 26.4. Bloodthirster as a rush likely isn't that much better, but slotted in as a later game purchase is definitely going to be worthwhile. We've already had Samira placed in the S tier, so that's where she will remain for 26.4, as we don't think this buff will turn her into an OP pick. A couple of impactful Xayah buffs are on the way, with her Q mana cost dropping from 50 to 35. E mana cost is being reduced as well, going from 30 to 20, and then W cooldown will be reduced from 20 scaling to 16 seconds to 18 scaling to 14 seconds. So with those mana cost buffs, it will be really interesting to see if priority shifts over to Yuntal or Stormrazor for 26.4. Essence Reaver's relative value goes down a bit because of the changes, since you won't be getting as much value out of the mana refund passive. That W buff is actually super nice for the mid to late game as well, because the DPS strength of Xayah goes up a ton when her W is available, and it's a spell you can be spamming straight off cooldown in skirmishes, so 2 seconds is pretty big. We could be overhyping the changes, but we think there's a good chance Xayah becomes a top tier ADC for 26.4 as a result of these buffs, so we will be moving her from A into S tier. Aphelios is going to be losing some damage for this patch, with his passive AD going down from 5 scaling to 30 to 4 scaling to 24. Change won't kill Aphelios, but we don't see him being an upper tier ADC anymore, so we'll be moving him from A into B tier. The best ADC from 26.3 is being nerfed this patch, as Jinx will have her armor growth reduced from 4.7 to 4.2. So in total, you will be losing 9 armor at level 18. Change probably results in about a 1% win rate drop for Jinx, which should keep her slightly above most of the S tier ADC power-wise, but not significantly above like she was before. So instead of dropping Jinx down the tier list, we will instead move 2 ADCs up into the OP tier to join her, as there will now be a few picks rivaling Jinx for that top spot. And then the one other traditional ADC who's nerfed for this patch is Twitch, with his health growth going down from 104 to 98, and armor growth is being reduced from 4.2 to 4. Pretty light nerfs overall, and we don't see these ones reducing Twitch's overall power level a significant amount. If anything, Twitch could get stronger for this patch with the buffs to Hex Optic C44, as the item has actually been performing really well as a rush on him in recent patches despite its lower sample size. Swain has really excelled as a bot lane carry to start Season 16, holding a win rate north of 53%, so Riot has a few nerfs lined up for 26.4. W slow is being lowered from 50 scaling to 70% to 50% at all ranks. Our DPS AP ratio is dropping from 5 to 4%, while R2 AP ratio is down from 50 to 40%. And then R2 decaying slow is dropping from 75 to 50%. These nerfs honestly seem quite light on paper relative to how much Swain has been overperforming in recent patches. As we mentioned when covering mid lane, Swain doesn't stack a whole lot of raw AP. He doesn't like Rabadon's, so AP ratio nerfs don't hurt him as much as other mages, while Liandry's and Rylai's have way less AP than items like Storm Surge, Shadow Flame, and Horizon Focus. At most, we could see him lose 2% win rate, but even then, he would still be a really strong pick. So we don't see any reason to drop Swain down the tier list for 26.4, as he will remain up in the S tier. So if we have a look at the ADC tier list for 26.4, this is definitely going to be the patch where the role is the most balanced we've seen it all season long. Jinx, Twitch, and Misfortune are going to make up the OP tier, as we think they will land a cut above all else, but even then, they really aren't that much better than any of the other S tier ADCs. Hexoptic C44 has the potential to shake up build priority on a lot of different champions for this patch, depending on how impactful the buffs land. We'll be sure to keep you guys updated in the coming patches with all new builds that pop up, so be sure to check back when our updated tier list drops on the 23rd of February. Mages like Veigar and Brand will continue to be the most OP bot lane champs that you can play, but we aren't going to place them in the OP tier because this is an ADC tier list, and it would just feel wrong that Veigar and Brand is the only OP picks. It's actually criminal how insane Brand and Veigar are performing right now, with win rates above 54%, so the new bot lane role quest for this season has just pushed mages into a disgustingly broken spot. Since they have very low play rates, they are way less likely to be nerfed though, so if you want some easy elo, or if you are a mid lane main and want to queue for bot secondary, then that is a really good strategy for you to run right now as well. Just a few support champs being adjusted for this patch, and first up we've got some buffs to Lux. So base mana is going down, which is a nerf, but everything else is a buff, so Lux will be power positive for 26.4. Mana regen is up, being increased from 7 to 9. Q cooldown will be lowered from 11 scaling to 9 seconds to 10 seconds at all ranks. And then W cooldown drops from 14 scaling to 10 seconds to 12 scaling to 10 seconds. So these should finally be the buffs that Lux needs to make her way out of the lower percentile of the support tier list, as we are giving her a bump from B into A tier for 26.4. Braum has been the most OP support for every single patch of the season so far, and he's been nerfed in multiple different ways, but the nerfs were never enough to significantly reduce his power. So Riot's back again in 26.4 with another round of nerfs, as Braum R cooldown is going up from 120 scaling to 80 seconds to 130 scaling to 100 seconds, and R damage is dropping from 150 scaling to 450 to 150 scaling to 350. So is this finally the patch where Braum drops out of the OP tier? We think so, but we thought so last patch as well, and the nerfs weren't quite enough, but Braum was just barely ahead of Sona and Nami in 26.3, so we definitely expect these nerfs to warrant a push out of OP and down into S. Senna is going to be adjusted so that her AD builds become stronger and Enchanter setups become weaker. Riot will be achieving this by nerfing the base damage on Senna's Q while buffing its AD ratio, and they've got the same change plan for W, where base damage is down and AD ratio is up. So Senna's overall power level likely drops off a bit for this patch due to Enchanter builds becoming weaker. Enchanter builds were just so ahead of AD builds in recent patches, and was the main reason to why she was in S tier, so even with the AD builds gaining some scaling power, we don't think they will gain enough power to overtake Enchanter builds, and therefore we're going to be dropping Senna down from S into A tier. So this is how we've got the support tier list aligned for 26.4, as the OP tier will now consist of Sona and Nami. Braum dropping down in power gives room for Nami to move up, as she's been overperforming a ton in recent patches. So with Braum now nerfed yet again, a melee support like Maokai, who just got buffed last patch, is looking a lot more attractive now. Maokai gained a good chunk of power from his Q buff in 26.3 and is outperforming all other melee supports, so in terms of an easy to pick up and effective support champion for solo queue, nobody beats him right now. We're pretty surprised that Riot didn't follow up with any Mel buffs for 26.4, because people are still playing her as a support with her play rate around 5% in the lower elos, but her win rate is literally 45%. So until Riot buffs Mel, definitely stop picking her for solo queue, because you're statistically making things way harder on yourself than you need to. So overall, pretty light patch for support with only 3 champion changes, so not much will shift meta-wise as we head into 26.4. Alright guys, one last thing, our rank up guarantee is insane. It's like signing up for the gym and getting a refund if you don't get ripped. That's how confident we are in SkillCapped. We obsess over making the best guides with top players, rigorous testing, and top tier video editing to make your climb easy. If you're ready to level up, visit SkillCapped.com and see the difference. So there you have it everyone, that is a complete look at the solo queue tier list for every single role as we head into 26.4. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.